People remember the noise first, the arguments, the shouting, the matches that looked one bad line call away from complete disaster. Maybe that is fair. I gave the world plenty of those moments. But what most people never understood is that I cared about tennis too much to stay quiet around it. And after spending my entire life inside this sport, to playing against legends, watching dynasties rise and collapse, somebody finally asked me a question that sounded simple until I actually tried to answer it. Who are the greatest players you have ever seen? Not the most famous, not the most marketable, the greatest. That changes everything. Because when you stand across the net from certain people, the scoreboard stops mattering for a second. You feel something else instead: fear, helplessness, sometimes even admiration you do not want to admit out loud. So this is my list. 5 players who changed the way I understood tennis forever. And trust me, by the time we reach number 1/2, the audience is probably going to disagree with me. You know, sometimes history rewrites itself a little too neatly. People look back now and act like Andre was always destined to become Andre Agassi. 8 Grand Slams, the comeback story, the legend. But that is not how it felt when he first appeared. Not from where I was standing. Back then he looked almost like a dare aimed directly at the entire sport. I remember sitting in locker rooms in the late 1980s, hearing older tennis people talk about him with this strange mixture of fascination and irritation, almost like they could already sense the game changing underneath their feet, but did not want to admit it out loud yet. And honestly, I understood the feeling. Tennis had always carried this certain image about itself. Discipline, tradition, quiet, respectability. Then suddenly here comes this kid from Las Vegas with long hair, denim shorts, neon colors, and a return of serve that sounded like a gunshot inside the stadium. At first, you almost wanted to dismiss it as marketing. Then the matches started, and that changes everything. Because underneath all the noise was somebody seeing the ball earlier than almost anybody I had ever faced. Andre took time away from players in a way that felt deeply personal. You would hit what felt like a good serve, maybe even a great serve, and somehow the ball was already screaming back at your feet before your brain fully processed what happened. That gets inside your stomach after a while. I really felt it at Wimbledon in 1992. By then I already knew my career was entering a different chapter. Athletes feel that before the public does. Your body starts negotiating with you differently. Recovery takes longer. Confidence becomes quieter. You stop assuming there will always be another big run waiting around the corner. Meanwhile, Andre looked like somebody running toward the future at full speed. Hungry, restless, completely unafraid of what older generations thought about him. And the crowd felt different around him too. That is important. People who had never cared about tennis suddenly cared when Andre played. Kids cared, casual fans cared, television cared, sponsors definitely cared. He turned tennis into something larger than the sport itself, something closer to popular culture. Maybe some people watching this are old enough to remember that shift. It was real. And for players from my era, it was a strange thing to witness because part of you admired it while another part quietly understood what it meant. The old version of tennis was fading. The sport was becoming louder, faster, more commercial, more global. Andre did not create that wave by himself, but he became the face of it. That semifinal at Wimbledon stayed with me for years, not because of the result alone, but because of what I felt walking off the court afterward. It felt like standing in the doorway between 2 generations and realizing the door was already closing behind you. People talk about losses in sports like they are purely physical experiences. They are not. Some losses feel emotional long before they appear on a scoreboard. Andre gave me that feeling. And here is the strange thing. I did not even fully appreciate him yet at the time. That came later. As the years passed and the image slowly peeled away, I started noticing the other side of him. The pressure, the confusion, the exhaustion that comes from becoming a symbol before you fully understand yourself as a person. A lot of athletes break under that weight. Andre somehow survived it long enough to eventually become honest about it. I respected that more than than people realize. And because the truth is, tennis has always been full of players pretending to be perfectly fine when they are completely lost inside. Andre finally stopped pretending, and maybe that is his real legacy. Yes, he changed the style of the sport. Yes, he changed the audience. Yes, he helped drag tennis into a completely different cultural era. But more than anything, he made individuality feel possible inside a world that used to fear it. That takes courage, especially in a sport that spent decades trying to make everybody behave the same way. And whether the traditionalists liked it or not, tennis never looked the same again after Andre Agassi arrived. Number 4 is Pete Sampras. I do not think people understand anymore how strange Pete felt when he first arrived. Not strange in personality, strange in effect. American tennis was loud when I grew up. Connors was loud, I was loud. Andre brought a completely different kind of noise later. Emotion was part of the performance. The crowd expected to feel your pulse from the stands. Then Pete showed up and removed almost all of it. I remember the first time I sat across from him thinking he looked almost too calm for his age. 19 years old at the US Open and carrying himself like somebody arriving early for a business meeting. No wasted movement, no visible nerves, nothing theatrical about him at all. At first you almost wait for a young player like that to crack a little, because they always do eventually. The stadium gets louder, the arm tightens, the legs stop listening properly, something leaks emotionally. But with Pete, nothing ever seemed to leak. That was the unsettling part. I remember walking to the baseline during our match at the 1990 US Open and having this weird feeling creep into my stomach. Not panic, exactly, something colder than that. The feeling that the usual chaos of a big match was only happening on one side of the net. Mine, Pete looked untouched by all of it. And when somebody that young starts looking emotionally untouchable under pressure, you pay attention very quickly. People always talk about the serve first. I get it. Sometimes the ball came through the court so cleanly it barely sounded real. You would guess correctly, move correctly, stretch the racket exactly where it needed to be, and somehow still feel late. That can wear your confidence down quietly. But honestly, the serve was only part of the problem. The real problem was what happened after. Nothing changed in him emotionally, whether he hit an ace or missed a volley by 2 feet. Same expression, same walk, same rhythm between points. It felt like playing against somebody who had already decided panic was a useless emotion years before the rest of us figured it out. And maybe that is why Pete aged differently inside the sport than most players do. The pressure never seemed to consume him publicly. I used to think crowds needed emotion from athletes to fully connect with them. Maybe part of me still believes that a little. But Pete forced people like me to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes greatness is quiet. Sometimes it does not explain itself to you. Sometimes it just keeps holding serve until your hope slowly disappears. That kind of tennis can feel suffocating, especially on grass. There were moments against Pete where you would sit down during a changeover and realize you had actually played pretty well, maybe even very well, and somehow you were still losing anyway. That messes with a competitor more than a bad loss does, because at least chaos gives you something to fight. Precision does not. I remember later in his career hearing younger players talk about Pete almost the way heavyweight boxers used to talk about walking into a ring already trailing on the scorecards mentally. Before the match even started, they understood how small the margins were going to be. One loose game, one missed first serve, one nervous volley, done. And the strange thing is Pete never looked hungry for attention while all this was happening. He never chased the spotlight emotionally, never seemed interested in becoming larger than the sport itself. In an era where personalities were becoming brands, Pete stayed almost stubbornly private. At the time, I do not think I appreciated that enough. Now I probably do, because it takes a certain kind of confidence to let your game speak in a world constantly demanding performance outside the lines too. There is something else people rarely saw. In locker rooms, Pete was actually warmer than the public version people imagined. Funny sometimes, relaxed, easy to be around. Then the match started and everything unnecessary disappeared from him almost instantly. I always found that fascinating. Some players bring their emotions onto the court. Pete locked his away before he walked onto it. And honestly, I am still not sure which approach is harder. What I know is this: Pete changed the definition of mental toughness for an entire generation of American tennis players. Before him, toughness often looked emotional: fire, energy, intensity. Pete made toughness look still. That is much scarier, because when somebody across the net stops needing emotion to survive pressure, you begin realizing there may not be a door into the match anymore, only a wall. And for a very long time, Pete Sampras was the cleanest wall in tennis. Number 3 is Bjorn Borg. You know, there are certain people you would never fully explain to yourself. Bjorn was one of those people for me. Even now, I was still a kid the first time I saw him up close, and I remember something about the room changing before I even understood why. That sounds dramatic now, I know. But sometimes memory tells the truth more clearly than logic does. People became quieter around him, not because he demanded attention, because he never seemed to need it. That is a very different kind of power, especially in sports. I grew up around noise. American tennis was noise, crowds, personalities, emotion. Everybody trying to impose themselves on the moment somehow. Then here comes this Swedish guy who barely raised his pulse publicly and somehow became bigger than all of it anyway. At that age, I could not fully understand what I was looking at. I just knew it stayed with me. Years later, the strange part became obvious. I turned into almost the complete opposite of Bjorn on a tennis court. I argued, I exploded, I carried every emotion out into the open where everybody could see it. Bjorn did the exact reverse. He locked everything away somewhere unreachable. I was fire, he was ice, and maybe that is exactly why we understood each other better than people expected. I still think about Wimbledon 1980 more than I probably should. Some matches disappear slowly over time. That one never did. Even now, people stop me to talk about the tiebreak in the 4th set. The tension, the pressure, the feeling that nobody watching could breathe normally anymore. And honestly, what I remember most is not even the tennis itself. It was Bjorn's face. Nothing changed. I am serious. The entire stadium felt like it was shaking emotionally, and somehow Bjorn still looked calmer than the ball kid standing beside the court. Can you imagine what that does to the person across the net? You start searching for signs: frustration, tightness, fear, anything human that tells you pressure is reaching them too. But with Bjorn, those signs almost never arrive publicly. That can make you feel very alone out there. People sometimes ask me if I hated losing those matches to him. Honestly, no. What scared me more was realizing how badly I wanted his respect. That is different, because when admiration gets mixed together with rivalry, the whole emotional experience becomes harder to untangle. Part of you wants to beat them. Another part almost needs them to remain exactly who they are. I think Bjorn understood that before I did. Then suddenly he was gone. 26 years old. That is still difficult for me to process sometimes. Imagine climbing a mountain your entire life only to realize the mountain decided to disappear while you were still climbing it. That is what it felt like after Bjorn retired. People saw the headlines, the shock, the retirement, but what they did not really see was what it did emotionally to the players who orbited around him. Especially me, because when Bjorn left, part of my own identity on the tennis court left with him. I am not sure I admitted that properly back then. The truth is, rivalries give, and we athletes structure emotionally. They give meaning to your obsession. And whether we said it publicly or not, Bjorn and I needed each other more than people realized. Without him there, tennis suddenly felt quieter in the wrong way, less meaningful somehow. Years later, at the Laver Cup, sitting beside him again as captains, I started noticing something I had missed when I was younger. Bjorn never tried to control a room, never dominated conversations, never forced leadership onto anybody. He just sat there calmly, and somehow everybody adjusted themselves around his energy naturally. That was always his gift. Presence, pure presence. Some athletes need the world to constantly confirm their greatness back to them. Bjorn never seemed interested in that exchange at all. It was like he had already made peace with himself privately long before the rest of us ever figured out who we were. I envy that a little even now, maybe more than a little. And Honestly, I think that is Bjorn's real legacy. Not only the Wimbledon titles, not only the French Opens, not even the rivalry we shared. It was the stillness, the ability to remain completely yourself while the entire world screamed around you to become something else. Very few people ever achieve that in sports or anywhere else. And after all these years, after all the matches and all the noise that followed me through life, I still think part of me has been trying to understand Bjorn Borg ever since I was a kid, standing quietly in that room, watching the temperature change around him. Number two is Roger Federer. There are players you respect. There are players you fear. Then there are players who make you sit there quietly for a few seconds afterward because your brain is still trying to understand what your eyes just witnessed. Roger was that kind of player for me. The strange thing is, I never really felt like I was watching somebody strain to play tennis when Roger was out there. With most great champions, even the all-time great ones, you can still see the effort somewhere, the violence underneath, the movement, the calculation, the survival instinct. With Roger, so much of it looked removed from struggle, almost unfairly so. I remember those early Wimbledon years especially. By then I was spending more time in commentary booths than locker rooms. And honestly, that changes the way you observe the sport. When you are younger, you mostly watch tennis emotionally. Later, you start noticing rhythm, balance, timing, the tiny details that separate elite players from something rarer. Roger had all of it. But he also had something else that was harder to describe on television. Lightness. That is the word I always come back to. Everything around him felt lighter somehow. The movement, the racket head speed, even the pressure inside enormous matches seemed lighter when carried by him. Grass courts that looked slippery and exhausting for everybody else suddenly looked natural under Roger's feet, almost like the surface itself trusted him. I know that sounds ridiculous, but maybe some of you remember feeling the same thing watching him. There were moments at Wimbledon where the crowd stopped reacting like spectators and started reacting like people inside a concert hall. You could feel the difference immediately. Quieter between points, softer applause at times, almost protective of the beauty happening in front of them. Very few athletes ever create that atmosphere. And honestly, I do not think Roger fully understood what he was doing to people while it was happening. I remember watching one particular match years ago and suddenly catching myself laughing softly during a rally, not because anything funny happened, quite the opposite. The tennis was so clean, so absurdly precise that my brain reacted almost the way people react to magic tricks. You laugh because the alternative is admitting you cannot explain it. That was Roger at his best. There is something emotionally difficult about witnessing perfection up close, though. People do not talk about that enough. When somebody performs a craft at that level consistently, it quietly forces everybody around them into comparison, whether they want it or not. And Roger's game made comparison feel dangerous because suddenly the sport you spent your whole life understanding looked different in his hands. Simpler somehow, cleaner, like he had discovered extra time between shots the rest of the tennis world could not access. I used to think certain volleys I hit during my career were impossible to improve upon technically. Then Roger arrived and started half-volleying balls from his shoelaces like he was casually flipping pages in a book. That humbles you, even after everything. And here is the part casual fans probably missed. Roger carried enormous pressure from very early on because beauty creates expectation faster than almost anything else in sports. Once people decide you represent elegance, they stop wanting ordinary victories from you. They want transcendence every night. That is exhausting if you think about it long enough. Yet Roger somehow kept walking onto courts with that same calm expression, that same loose movement, that same sense that tennis was still bringing him joy instead of consuming him publicly. I admired that more as I got older. Because deep down, most champions become heavy eventually. Heavy from pressure, heavy from history, heavy from carrying versions of themselves the world refuses to let go of. Roger stayed remarkably light for a very long time. There is one thing I realized years into his dominance. Players were no longer just trying to beat Roger Federer. They were trying to survive the feeling he created around the sport itself. That is different, because when beauty becomes the standard, everybody else starts looking slightly incomplete by comparison. Fans expected more elegance after Roger, more creativity, more fluidity. The sport itself changed visually because of him. That is legacy. Not just winning, transformation. And honestly, I'm not sure we will ever fully appreciate what Roger did to tennis until enough time passes and people suddenly realize nobody else ever made the game feel quite that beautiful again. That is the burden of artists. The world only understands how rare they were after the silence arrives. And for a long time, Roger Federer made tennis feel less like competition and more like memory happening in real time. Number one is Novak Djokovic. And honestly, I know some people are going to get angry about that before I even finish speaking. That is part of the Novak experience. It always has been. You have to remember the timing of his arrival to fully understand what he was walking into. Roger was already Roger by then. Grace, elegance, global love. Rafa was becoming this force of nature people emotionally attached themselves to almost immediately. The sport already had its mythology written. Then Novak arrived right in the middle of it. Not invited emotionally, just undeniable. At first, I do not think people understood what they were looking at. Even players did not fully understand it yet. We kept trying to describe him using older language. Flexible, tough, great returner, incredible movement. None of those descriptions were big enough, because what Novak eventually became was something much stranger than that. He became inevitable. I remember watching some of those early battles against Rafa and Roger and feeling this subtle shift happen over time. At first, Novak looked like the disruptor, the third man trying to break into a locked room. Then suddenly one day you looked up and realized he was no longer chasing their standard anymore. He was replacing it. That is uncomfortable for people, especially in sports. Fans become emotionally invested in stories, heroes, rivalries, aesthetics. And Novak challenged all of it because his greatness did not always arrive wrapped in beauty or warmth. Sometimes it arrived looking clinical, relentless, mentally exhausting. But winning does not care about aesthetics. That is the truth. Sports eventually forces you to confront. There were moments watching Novak play where you could actually see opponents beginning to lose emotional energy during matches. Not physically first, emotionally. That is rare. He had this ability to stretch rallies and pressure until players slowly started questioning whether their best tennis would ever actually be enough. Can you imagine what that feels like across a net? Especially over 5 sets. I remember sitting there during some of those Australian Open runs thinking something I almost did not want to say publicly yet. This might be the highest level of problem-solving tennis has ever seen. Because Novak did not just defend impossible balls. Everybody says that part already. What made him terrifying was what happened after the defense. Somehow he turned survival into control almost instantly. Most players defend to stay alive. Novak defended to take your belief away. That is different. And honestly, I think the crowd dynamics around him shaped him into something even more dangerous psychologically. Roger often received love naturally. Rafa inspired emotional loyalty immediately. Novak spent years feeling slightly outside of that emotional embrace, no matter how much he won. People sensed it. He definitely sensed it. And over time, instead of breaking him, it sharpened him. I have always believed athletes reveal who they truly are when the emotional conditions become unfair, when the crowd turns, when history resists them, when admiration does not arrive as easily as expected. That is where Novak became almost frightening mentally. There were matches where the stadium clearly wanted the other guy to win, and somehow Novak looked calmer because of it, like conflict gave him clarity instead of pressure. I still find that fascinating because most human beings need emotional comfort to perform freely. Novak often looked strongest when comfort disappeared entirely. There is one thing I learned after decades around this sport. Eventually, numbers force difficult conversations, whether people emotionally enjoy those conversations or not. And Novak's numbers stopped looking human a long time ago. The weeks at number one, the head-to-heads, the Masters titles, the Australian Opens, the longevity. At some point, the argument itself starts running out of places to hide. But honestly, the statistics are not what finally convinced me. It was the endurance, the psychological endurance, the ability to wake up every season with everybody already hunting you and still somehow finding another layer of improvement buried somewhere inside himself. Most champions eventually protect what they built. Novak kept expanding it year after year, pressure after pressure, era after era. That takes something deeper than talent. And maybe that is why I finally put him here at number one, even knowing how controversial it sounds. Because when I strip away preference, nostalgia, beauty style, personality, crowd reaction, all of it, and ask myself one uncomfortable question, very honestly, who is the most complete competitor this sport has ever produced? I keep arriving at the same answer. Novak Djokovic, maybe not the most universally loved, maybe not the most beautiful to watch, but possibly the strongest tennis mind and body ever assembled inside one human being. And deep down, I think even his rivals eventually understood that too. So that is my list. 5 names, 5 completely different human beings. And honestly, maybe that is what makes tennis so difficult to explain to people outside of it. There's no single way to become unforgettable in this sport, no single personality, no single style. Greatness arrives wearing different faces, depending on the era. Andre gave the sport freedom. Pete gave it precision. Bjorn gave it silence. Roger gave it beauty. And Novak gave it a new definition of endurance altogether. You know, when you spend your whole life inside tennis, eventually the trophies stop being the first thing you remember. People watching from the outside think athletes sit around counting titles forever. Maybe some do. I do not know. But memory works differently once enough years pass. You remember feelings. You remember walking onto a court and sensing your stomach tighten before warm-ups even started. You remember certain sounds. A serve landing heavier than expected. Shoes sliding on grass. A crowd suddenly becoming quieter because something extraordinary is unfolding in front of them. That is what stays. At least it does for me. And maybe that is why arguments about the greatest player ever never really end. People are not only defending statistics, they are defending emotions. Time periods, versions of themselves, the player who made them fall in love with the game in the first place. I understand that now better than I used to. When I was younger, I thought greatness meant domination, winning, imposing yourself on the world loudly enough that nobody could ignore you. Age changes the definition. Now I think greatness is what remains inside other people long after the match itself disappears. It is influence, memory, transformation, the ability to alter another competitor permanently just by sharing a court with them for a few hours. Every player on this list did that to me in some way. And honestly, I'm grateful for it now, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Because rivalries shape athletes emotionally, whether they survive those rivalries or not. Without those people across the net, you never fully meet yourself either. Maybe that is the real secret nobody tells young players soon enough. Your opponents are not interrupting your story. They are creating it with you. Sometimes I sit there now looking at modern tennis and wonder what happens 20 or 30 years from today when another former player gets asked this same impossible question. Another retired champion sitting under studio lights trying to explain greatness to a younger world that never fully saw these men in real time. Will my name come up? Honestly, I do not know. But I hope somewhere in that conversation they remember one thing about me. I care deeply, too deeply sometimes. And maybe that was always the whole point of tennis in the first place.